First of all, now you can stop me. When I was in my previous jobs, nobody could, and so I'm getting used to this being stopped. And secondly, you said that I have, in addition to my career, the ability to research and do that. I'm not sure government people can do a lot of intellectual and creative thinking, at least not as far as I am aware of. So, Sabah al-Khair jami'an, it's a pleasure to be with you. We will be, Milena and myself, actually Milena did most of the work, but I'm the boss, so I have to be there. We will be speaking about the relationship between food security and FDI. And we believe that, as I'm sure you all know, there is a strong relationship between FDI, between food security and all of these components and the challenges that we face today, especially in the region. The question of population, land and water constraints, food price volatility. As I'm sure you know, the region is the largest, or at least the most sensitive region to food price volatility in the world. So, because of our food deficit. From that perspective, we looked at the relationship between food security and food insecurity as a threat to any attempt to poverty reduction. It's a threat to social cohesion. Just take an example of the drought that struck eastern Syria in the time 2007-2010. And that's an example of what could food insecurity in some parts of this region do to the political stability of a country. In fact, I am sure, and I can tell you from someone who knows, that some of the problems we are facing today is originating in those years of drought in the eastern part of the country. And then it affects, of course, long-term economic prospects, because in fact, we have abandoned in the neoliberal paradigm that we adopted in the past 20 years, we have abandoned manufacturing and agriculture. And therefore, it's proving today that this abandonment of the real economy has been a threat to economic sustainability and longevity. So we believe that the food insecurity question, and of course now, as you can see, with all the attempts to diffuse public anger in the region, an increase in food subsidy has been attempted by many governments, and it has put more pressures on the already limited fiscal space available to middle income and least developed countries in this part of the world. That's, I'm entering here, let me go back, just to show you as you can see, public debts are growing, especially, and if you look at the numbers in 2011 that I should be showing here, you can see that public debt has shot up. And again, I'm using my country as an example. In 2010, public debt was very minimal. It was about 24% of GDP, and now the numbers have increased dramatically because of attempts to increase food subsidies and fuel subsidies to diffuse some of the public anger. How do you go back? Okay. We believe that there has been very little public investment in agriculture, and you can clearly see from those numbers that public spending has not, you compare defense with agriculture, this is what we tried to do, and you can see the difference is very clear. I mean, we have been spending on defense with static and actually decreasing spending on agriculture, and I'm not sure that spending on defense has produced national security, while not spending on agriculture has been detrimental to national security. Okay, and then if we just take a quick look at the share of food in household consumption in the region, it's very high, and also you can see that the food bill in total merchandise imports in the region is very high. So practically the same countries that have huge dependence or a larger share of food consumption in their per capita consumption and household consumption are the countries that have a very large share of food imports in their trade balances. And then we can see that the countries, most of the countries in the region have witnessed an increased level of rural and urban poverty, especially rural poverty in our part of the world. Let me say that the countries that have less poverty in general in the last 20 years have reduced poverty through improvement in urban poverty, not in rural poverty. And this is a dilemma in the Arab region, that we have 50% of Arabs live in the countryside. Agriculture only produces 15% of our GDP, and most of the poverty is in the rural area. So you have this dilemma and a paradoxical situation that needs to be addressed dramatically. I will come to FDI. I'm saying here we are showing two countries that had invested heavily in rural development, and you can see that rural poverty levels have slightly decreased in those countries compared to some other in the region. And you can see here that the responses of the governments to the 2007-2008 global food crisis has been mainly to increase food subsidies, and it has led to an increase in budget deficits and made more strains on the limited fiscal space, as I mentioned. And we are facing today a situation where there is a constraint on fiscal space in most middle income and least developed Arab countries, and that's the entry point where we are suggesting that FDI could be, and there are many, many conditions how it could be. It is not a straightforward equation, and we will refer to that quickly. Let me hand over to my colleague Milena, who has done this part of the presentation, and I'll come back to the conclusion.
So good morning, even on my behalf. So as you can see on this graph, we tried to plot the countries of the Arab region by the price risk that they are running, that we have proxied with the fiscal balance as percentage of GDP, and the quantity risk that they are running as their food balance as percentage of the GDP. We are fully aware that these proxies are very, let's say, relative, but still believe that they depict quite a good picture about the risks that the countries in the region are running. So you can see that most of the countries in the region are actually having fiscal deficits, and in the same time they are food insecure, meaning that they have a huge food deficit. So we can see that the countries, especially the least developed countries, are the ones that are fiscally strained and have food deficits, which poses a big question: how are they going to finance their food import bill in the future? As I have said, Arab countries are running both price risk and quantity risk, whereas GCC countries are running more of a quantity risk, and the more diversified economies, as we call them, are running more of a price risk. But also, in the recent time, we have seen certain decoupling of the oil prices and food prices, which doesn't necessarily lead to only quantity risk for the GCC countries, because there will be times when basically the oil prices, which make 80% of their revenues, are so low and the food prices are spiking. So in that context, we are also asking the question of the quantity risk that they are as well running. So talking about the more diversified economies, they have definitely more potential for agricultural development. There is one simple statement from the FAO estimating $83 billion to be invested in agricultural development annually in order to meet food needs in 2050. So this is the main question and the main idea of our presentation, is how to finance the food import bill and the agricultural investment in this region, depending on certain countries. We are saying, basically, we're not advocating for any solution. We're just putting some facts on the table and saying, in the times of limited fiscal space of the countries in the region and very low actually, public investment in agriculture, we believe that private investment and foreign direct investment have the potential to fill that investment gap in agriculture. What's very interesting to show is that the countries in the region, there you can see the arable land as percentage of their total land. There are countries with around 20% of their total land to be arable, but those same countries have very low level of the agricultural land that is actually irrigated. So we believe that the FDI has the potential, under certain, of course, considerations, to bring technology transfer and modern agricultural techniques. So what are we advocating for in terms of FDI is some kind of a responsible FDI that will create a win-win solution or a positive sum game for both countries. Now, when it comes to receiving country, we believe that each receiving country has the responsibility at the government level to crowd in investments in the private sector by undertaking huge, let's say, public expenditure, especially in infrastructure in rural areas, that will, let's say, by creating that and as well business environment, that will bring agricultural investment and especially some complementary investments in terms of moving up the value chain. Now I will brings us to the issue of land grab, and I will give actually the floor to my boss. Thank you.
We are colleagues here, my friend. So thank you, Milena. 3 minutes, that should be enough. Thank you. 2 minutes, that should be enough. Our message is very simple. So far, FDI in agriculture in the region has not picked up. There is no clear regulatory framework which ensures the empowerment of farmers in the investment targeted countries. There is a risk of actually excluding those farmers from the investment projects, which will even hurt food security even further in those countries, because maybe, and we believe that the agricultural production in these investment projects will not be directed at consumption needs in the country where the investment is going to. And therefore you will have further exclusion. We all know that the region has suffered from the political economy of exclusion in the last 20 years, and it erupted because of that. FDI in agriculture should not deepen this rift. It should actually be very inclusive. It should make sure it's part of a comprehensive rural development strategy of the country. It's part of a poverty reduction and empowering strategy in those countries. Of course, the legal terms and the financial terms have to be very well defined and very well designed. Just to prove that the current legal framework is not suitable, we can see the very low levels of bank loans to the agricultural sector in the region. In other words, the projects, agriculture in the region is not bankable. I would call agriculture today in the region is a lifestyle more than it is an economic project. And therefore, investments will not come unless there is this regulatory framework which protects the rights of both the investor and the local population and the national economy of the target countries. We have taken a look at the concept of land grab. There is a risk. However, the percentage of investments that have led to land grab so far is very, very limited. And the experience has not been very positive until now. So, as my friend Milena said, we are not advocating just FDI in agriculture. We are advocating FDI in agriculture through a comprehensive rural development strategy which is inclusive, participatory, and very, very transparent. We in ESCWA have already started working with the government of Sudan, for example, to help them establish such a regulatory framework in order to attract FDI in the right way and in the right projects. Thank you very much.